moving into part two of imperialism across the world. We're going to be focusing on Africa first. The scramble for Africa, as it's kind of known, displayed European imperialism at its most frantic. In the last quarter of the 19th century, almost all of Africa, 1/5 of the world's landmass, was carved up by Europeans. The Berlin Conference, at which Europeans, most of whom had never been to Africa, representing different countries of Europe, laid the groundwork for the European division of the continent. This is often depicted as Europeans sitting around a table, Africa in the middle as like a pie, and them just dividing up the continent without knowing any of the social, linguistic, or political markers. By 1900, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. The British strategy in this meeting was to have empire spanning from the Cape to Cairo. This guy's name is Cecil Rhodes, depicted in the cartoon here. He has one of the things that made Europeans so successful technologically at this time, the telegraph wire. Western nations, I should say, not specifically Europeans. And he's going from the Cape of South Africa all the way up to Cairo here. Cecil Rhodes is who Rhodesia is named after, the country Rhodesia in Africa. And he had a bunch of different mines there using the rich mineral resources from Africa to make his fortune. The French, of course, were going from east to west, and there are still large swaths of the African continent where one of the language people speak is either British or French. The Belgians, the Germans, the Italians, and the United States all also took a piece of the pie. And like I said, Ethiopia and Liberia remained the only independent nations. So here you can see Africa in 1914 divided up. And here it is in the early 1800s, right? Preference was given, as we'll talk about in class, to countries that had already established ports in different regions, but other than that, it was basically a free-for-all. One of the things that really held Africa back in terms of resisting is the extreme, let me change my pen here, the extremely large amount of ethnic and linguistic differences in Africa. And Europeans use this to their advantage. There are literally thousands of languages spoken across this continent, and what Europeans would do is divide up ethnic groups amongst different colonies, trying to get multiple groups within their same colony. And in this way, they could prey on different conflicts that had existed before. And also, they could use these different linguistic differences to kind of pit different groups against each other. This was done in many areas, including the Congo, which we'll be talking about more extensively in class. And it even shows up in modern conflicts, such as Rwanda. So before we get into the Southeast Asia or Oceania, we need to talk a little bit more about controlling colonies. There's two main types of control, indirect and direct. Indirect is where the colony is controlled mainly by locals who represent Europeans. India is a place that at first was controlled indirectly and then transitioned to be direct after the Sepoy Rebellion. But it was still a place where not a minority of Europeans moved to. More direct control, again, would be like India, would be controlled directly by Europeans. So the government administrators are all European. And that was India kind of after the Sepoy Rebellion, and also places like South Africa, um, Egypt. Then there's settler versus non-settler colonies. Settler colonies usually had fairly temperate climates, and they were where you got a lot of European settlers, obviously. These settlers usually got the best land, and if you remind me, we can talk about what happened in Kenya with this land. It was pretty brutal. And then you have non-settler colonies like the Congo, where they were mainly, these were places that were mainly just used for resources. So getting further into this, Egypt was again of strategic importance. It was not really a settler colony, but it was directly controlled by Europeans because of its significance to the British. Cape Town and the Boer War, um, these were places that were controlled directly by the British because of the Boer War in South Africa. And South Africa was also a settler colony. And then the Congo was mainly indirect rule, and it was also a non-settler colony. So now we're going to move into Southeast Asia. As you can see, some of the main players here, you can see the Russian expansion happening. Here's Crimea, BTW. You can see the British holdings in India. The princely states of India, those are important, but for our purposes, we can think of them as being allied with the British, so basically the same. You can see the Dutch with their extreme control over the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch were particularly brutal with slavery in these colonies. The Philippines, which were at first controlled by Spain, but then the United States won them in the Spanish-American War. And then the imperialism of Japan as well. Some of these islands that Japan and China are disputing over right now are the same islands that they won control over at this time. Imperialism was also a big deal in Oceania. There was a large loss of life in these colonies because of zero resistance to European diseases. And we'll see this in a graph later on. Australia became a penal colony, meaning that it was for petty criminals. Okay, we have a little bit of time to move into Asia. And if we run out of time, we'll stop the video and move into effects later on. So India fell under British control after the foothold that the British East India Company established. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, had control of Indonesia, and these colonies were both controlled indirectly by these companies. But these companies had incredible power. They could start wars if they needed to. India became the jewel in the crown of the Indian Empire, or of the Indian Empire, of the British Empire. But crushing the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857 led to direct imperial rule in India and signaled a transformation of the relationship between the Indians and the British. And there became more of a social hierarchy, a top-down kind of a system, and we'll see this in class in our video. Atrocities such as the Kanpur massacre or the British practice of blowing up mutineers with cannons meant that any earlier mutual respect or tolerance was gone. And India was clearly a nation, like I'm showing here, of ruled and rulers. While the British may have won the competition over India, competition was the normal state of affairs in almost every place else. As part of the Great Game, the Russians and the British competed for domination over Central Asia. In the end, however, Russian dreams of controlling Afghanistan and India came to nothing, and Afghanistan partially became under the control of the British, partially not. The British expanded into Southeast Asia and took control of Burma and Malay as well. Oops, excuse me, Malaya. The French took control of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. There is a lot of cuisine that has become popular in the United States lately that's kind of a product of this fusion. If you've ever had the Vietnamese sandwiches with the pickled pork on a French baguette, that would be an example of the cultural interaction. And this is also where the Vietnam War kind of begins its history. This is obviously not where the Vietnam War starts. That's not what I'm trying to suggest. I'm just saying that this is kind of the early um, inklings of conflict there. And lastly, in the Opium War, which we talked about last chapter, was another example of imperialism. The opium from that the British were having produced in India was being shipped to China against Chinese wishes, and that was a huge part of the British economy in India. An even bigger part of the British economy, though, was cotton. And from 1750 to 1900, Europeans greatly increased their share of manufacturing output of finished goods from 23% of the global supply to 63%. And this is mainly because of the industrialization. Remember, India used to be the largest producer of cotton and cotton goods, but India plummets from manufacturing 34% of cotton goods to 1.7% of cotton goods. And this is because the British made it basically illegal for them to sell. Excuse me, this is not just cotton goods. It's all goods, sorry, coming from India. But the British made it basically illegal for the Indians to sell these finished products. And China as well goes from 32% to 6.2% of the world's share of finished goods. So it's quite the marked difference. Imperialism definitely has a huge impact. Thus, we're going to stop with this part of the PowerPoint, and in the next part of the PowerPoint, we'll go into the United States and Japan and the legacies of imperialism.